In 2026, researchers working with DNA samples from thousands of people made a breakthrough that changed everything. They discovered 5 new genetic variants that had never been properly understood before. These variants revealed that nearly half of all people don't have the eye color their genes were supposedly supposed to give them. The answer to why? It's locked in your DNA, and scientists have finally figured out how to read it. For decades, we lived with this beautifully simple understanding of how eye color worked. It was taught in schools, passed down through generations, and seemed to explain almost everything about inheritance. Brown was dominant, blue was recessive. It was that straightforward. You looked at your parents' eyes, did some quick mental math with Punnett squares, and boom, you could predict your child's eye color before they were even born. Or at least, that's what we all believed. But the truth was far more complicated than anyone ever imagined, and nowhere was this complexity more evident than in the mystery of hazel eyes. Hazel eyes have always been the enigma of the eye color world. They're not quite brown and not quite green. They shimmer with flecks of gold and amber. They change appearance depending on the light, the clothes you're wearing, and even your emotional state. They're found across the globe, but concentrated in specific populations. And for the longest time, science couldn't quite explain how they worked or where they came from. Now, thanks to groundbreaking genetic research, we finally have some answers. And these answers are going to fundamentally change how you think about your own genetics and human evolution itself. The journey to understanding hazel eyes begins with understanding the basic mechanism of eye color. Your eye color is determined by how much of a pigment called melanin is present in your iris. That melanin is produced by specialized cells, and the amount and type of melanin that gets produced is controlled by your genes. But here's where it gets interesting. For the longest time, scientists thought eye color was controlled by just one gene. One single gene determined everything. This model was called the OCA2 gene theory, and it seemed to explain most of what we observed about eye color inheritance. But as genetic technology advanced and scientists could look deeper into human DNA, they discovered something shocking. It wasn't one gene. It wasn't 2 genes. It was up to 16 different genes working together in an extraordinarily complex dance to determine your eye color. These genes interacted with each other in ways that scientists were still trying to understand. They influenced how much melanin was produced. They influenced where that melanin was distributed in your iris. They influenced how light scattered through the iris. And most surprisingly, they didn't follow the simple dominant and recessive patterns that we'd all been taught. The 2 most important genes in this process are called OCA2 and HERC2. They're located right next to each other on chromosome 15. OCA2 produces a protein that controls the maturation of melanin. It's the gene responsible for actually making the pigment that colors your eyes. HERC2 is equally important because it regulates the OCA2 gene itself. Think of HERC2 as an on and off switch. When it's in the on position, OCA2 gets activated and starts producing melanin. When it's in the off position, melanin production decreases. This relationship between HERC2 and OCA2 is so tightly linked that scientists often refer to them together as the HERC2-OCA2 locus. And this locus is responsible for the vast majority of eye color variation in human populations around the world. In fact, researchers have determined that these 2 genes account for more variation in eye color than any other genetic factors combined, which is why they've received such intense scientific scrutiny over the past decades. But understanding which genes are involved is only part of the puzzle. The real breakthrough came when scientists started looking at something called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. These are tiny variations in the DNA sequence at specific locations. A single nucleotide is just one letter in your genetic code. Most of the time, this letter is the same in everyone. But sometimes, due to ancient mutations that spread through populations over thousands of years, some people have a different letter at that same location. And these tiny differences, seemingly insignificant on the surface, can have enormous consequences for how your genes are expressed and how your physical characteristics develop. Scientists now understand that these SNPs are the key to understanding genetic variation in human populations. One particular SNP became famous in eye color genetics. It's called RS2913832, and it's located in a regulatory region within the HERC2 gene. This SNP acts like a master switch for eye color. If you have a certain version of this SNP, you're very likely to have blue eyes. If you have another version, you're very likely to have brown eyes. For years, scientists thought this single SNP could predict eye color with remarkable accuracy. They were wrong. When researchers did large population studies, they found that about 43% of people didn't have the eye color their RS2913832 genotype predicted. Their genes said they should have blue eyes, but they had brown eyes. Or their genes said brown, but they had blue. Something else was going on. This is where the 2026 breakthrough became so important. Scientists in Canada conducted a massive genome-wide association study, examining the genes of thousands of people with unexpected eye colors. They were looking for other genetic variants that could explain these discrepancies, and they found them. They identified 5 novel variants, markers that had never been properly associated with eye color before. 2 of these markers are in the OCA2 gene, 3 are in the HERQ gene. And together, these new markers paint a much more complete picture of how eye color is actually determined. The first of these newly discovered markers is called RSM74409 SLUDO36. It's located in the OCA2 gene, and when you carry a specific version of this variant, it influences melanin production in subtle but meaningful ways. The second is R7885445, also in OCA2, which seems to work in conjunction with other genetic factors to fine-tune melanin levels. The third is RS727141116, again in OCA2, adding yet another layer of complexity to how much pigment gets produced. The fourth is RS1919490, which is in HERC2, affecting how the switch operates. And the fifth is RS551217952, also in HERC2, which influences the regulatory mechanism in yet another way. This complexity extends beyond just hazel eyes. Eye color inheritance is just one example of how polygenic traits work in humans. Height is polygenic, influenced by hundreds of genetic variants. Skin color is polygenic. Intelligence is polygenic. Risk for various diseases is polygenic. The pattern we see with eye color, where multiple genes interact in complex ways and where simple dominant recessive inheritance doesn't apply, is actually the rule for most. Human traits, not the exception. We spent decades focusing on monogenic traits, single gene traits, because they were easy to study and easy to understand. But most of what makes us genetically unique involves polygenic inheritance. Understanding hazel eyes as a polygenic trait gives us insight into human genetic diversity more broadly. It shows us that the variation we see in human populations isn't random. It has a history. It reflects migration patterns and population mixing. It tells the story of where our ancestors came from and who they mixed with. When you look at someone with hazel eyes, you're looking at the physical manifestation of this genetic mixing. You're looking at genes that came from different populations, different continents, different ancestral groups that somehow found their way into the same person. For people who have hazel eyes themselves, this genetic knowledge can be personally meaningful. Your eye color literally carries within it the genetic legacy of human migration and mixing. If you have hazel eyes, there's a good chance that your ancestors came from multiple different populations. They came from regions with different climates, different environmental pressures, and different founding populations. Your eyes are a window into this mixing. They're a visible reminder that human populations have never been static or isolated. We've always been moving, mixing, and creating new combinations of genetic variation. The implications of this research extend beyond just academic interest. For forensic science, understanding eye color genetics has practical applications. If investigators have DNA from a crime scene, they might be able to predict what eye color a suspect likely has, narrowing down investigative leads. For personalized medicine, understanding. Pigmentation genetics helps researchers understand genetic variants associated with skin cancer risk, melanoma risk, and other pigmentation-related conditions. For ancestry research, eye color genetics provides another data point that can help people understand their genetic heritage and where their ancestors came from. As we look to the future of genetic research, several questions remain unanswered. Why does eye color appear to change in different lighting conditions? Is this purely a physical optics phenomenon, or does it involve actual changes in how the iris is structured? How much of eye color variation is due to these newly discovered variants versus the remaining unknown genetic factors? Will we ever be able to predict eye color with 99% accuracy, or is there a fundamental limit to how predictable polygenic traits can be? Are there any evolutionary advantages to hazel eyes compared to blue or brown eyes? Or are they simply a byproduct of admixture with no selective advantage themselves? These are the questions that the next generation of genetic researchers will tackle. As technology improves and as more genetic data is collected from diverse populations around the world, our understanding will continue to deepen. Already, there are projects underway to sequence the genomes of thousands of people from different populations, creating databases that researchers can use to identify new genetic variants associated with various traits. Each new variant that's discovered, each new pattern that's identified, brings us closer to a complete understanding of how human genetic variation works. The story of hazel eyes, in many ways, is a microcosm of the story of human genetics in the modern era. For a long time, we thought we understood how inheritance worked. We taught simple rules and created neat categories. But as we look deeper, as technology allowed us to see the actual DNA sequences and identify the specific variants, we discovered that the reality was far more complicated and far more interesting than we'd ever imagined. Hazel eyes are not a simple trait determined by 1 or 2 genes. They're the product of complex genetic interactions, shaped by human history, molded by migration and admixture, and fine-tuned by millions of years of evolution. Every person with hazel eyes carries this entire history in their genome. Your eyes are the product of ancient mutations that occurred in Europe thousands of years ago. They're the product of populations migrating across continents. They're the product of your ancestors, meeting and forming relationships with people from different populations. They're the product of genes mixing and recombining in just the right way to create this specific combination of melanin levels and iris structure. Your eye color is literally a window into your personal genetic history and the grand epic of human migration and evolution. The scientists who made the breakthrough in 2026 that identified those 5 new genetic variants weren't just solving an academic puzzle. They were unlocking a deeper understanding of how human genetic variation works. They were showing that our old models were incomplete. They were demonstrating that polygenic inheritance is the rule, not the exception. And they were providing tools that future researchers could use to continue unraveling the mysteries of human genetic diversity. If you have hazel eyes, or if you're curious about hazel eyes because they run in your family, the latest genetic research gives you a much deeper understanding of what's actually happening in your DNA. Your eye color is the result of a specific combination of genetic variants at multiple loci across your genome. Some of these variants have been known for years. Others were only discovered recently. Some of them are common in certain populations and rare in others. Together, they create the distinctive appearance that is hazel eyes. And if you don't have hazel eyes, this research is still relevant to you. Understanding hazel eyes helps us understand how all eye color inheritance works. It helps us understand how polygenic traits work in general. It helps us understand the history of human migration and population mixing. It helps us appreciate the incredible complexity and beauty of human genetic diversity. The fact that 2 parents with blue eyes can have a brown-eyed child, or that 2 brown-eyed parents can have a blue-eyed child, or that siblings can have completely different eye colors despite having the same parents. All of this becomes clear when you understand the polygenic nature of eye color and the role that genetic admixture plays. As we move forward, DNA testing for eye color will become more sophisticated. New variants will be discovered, prediction models will improve. Perhaps one day we'll be able to predict eye color with near-perfect accuracy by looking at someone's DNA. But even then, the story that eye color tells about your genetic heritage, about your ancestry, about where your relatives came from and how human populations have mixed and moved across the globe, that story won't get any less fascinating. If anything, as we understand more about the genetics behind hazel eyes and other traits, we'll gain even greater appreciation for the complexity and interconnectedness of human genetic history. And we'll understand that in our very DNA, literally in the genes that determine the color of our eyes, we carry the story of humanity's great migrations and mixings, written in the language of genetic variants and population frequencies. And that's a story that's absolutely worth understanding. In 1860, thing about a man tried to erase a crime by setting it on
hazel
fire
eyes
and
don't
sinking
fit
it to the
neatly
bottom
into
of
the
the brown or blue
He
category.
almost got away with it.
There's
For
something in between.
159 years.
They represent a
Then in
moderate level of
2019,
melanin in
something
the iris,
impossible happened.
combined with a
The river
specific
gave up its
distribution
secret.
pattern. To
The
understand
particular
why
way
this
that
river
light
was
scatters
hiding
through
something
the
so
eye.
important. This
Now
combination
to go
creates
back to a
that
bet made in
distinctive
a steamboat
appearance
saloon.
where hazel
A bet that
eyes
turned
turned into one of the most
multiple
brazen
colored
crimes in
ones.
American
They can
history.
appear more
And
golden
one
than
that would
sunlight,
echo for
more
generations.
greenish in other
By
light,
1860,
and almost brown
the
in
international
dim
slave
light.
trade had been
This
illegal in the
variability
United
is
States
one of
for
the
more than
defining
50
characteristics
years.
of hazel eyes.
Congress
And
had
it's directly
banned the
related to the
importation of enslaved
polygenic nature
people
of
from
how they're
Africa
produced.
all the way back. The genetic basis for hazel eyes involves a
Bringing
very
human being
specific
across the
combination
Atlantic
of
in
genetic
chains
variants.
was not just
You
immoral.
need to have certain
It was a
versions
federal
of the
crime,
OCA2
punishable by
SNP
death.
called RS.
Everyone in the
and
shipping
Tinetin
business knew it.
104
Everyone in
Ozone 7.
Alabama's high society knew
This
it.
particular SNP
And yet,
is
in the middle
associated
of
with
Mobile,
moderate melanin
one
levels,
wealthy landowner
the kind
decided
that
to
produces
law
green and
simply did
hazel
not
eyes
apply to
rather
him.
than the high levels.
His name was
that
Timothy
produce dark
Meeher.
brown eyes.
He was a steamboat
But you also
captain
need
and
to have
businessman who had made a
specific
fortune
combination
along
of
the Alabama
variants
River
that
moving
create a
cotton,
particular
timber,
regulatory
and goods
pattern.
up and down the
You might
water.
have different versions of
RS
RS 12913
Meeher was known for his arrogance, and one night, according to the story that has been passed down for generations, he made a wager that worked together to moderate melanin production. He bet that he could sail a ship to West Africa, load it with
This is why hazel eyes appear in families in such unpredictable ways.
nose of federal authorities.
Two parents without
without
hazel
ever being
eyes can
caught.
have a hazel-eyed
It was
child
not just
because
talk.
that child
Meeher
inherited
invented
a particular
He commissioned
combination
a
of genetic
two-masted
variants
schooner
from both parents.
with fast and sturdy
Variants
vessel
were there,
built for hauling
hiding
lumber,
in the
and
parents'
he gave it a
genomes,
name that would
not
become
fully expressed.
infamous.
Because of the
Clotilda.
specific combination
The
each
ship was
parent
placed
carried.
under the command of
But
a sea
when they
captain
mixed in
named
the
William
child,
Foster,
they created
a man
exactly
willing
the
to
right
risk his
combination
freedom
to produce
possibly
hazel
his
eyes.
neck
for the payouts so frequently that in the spring of 1860 completely revised their understanding of eye color inheritance. Crossed the Gulf of Mexico, not predictable by simple punnet squares, and began the long determined by dominant and recessive alleles in the traditional sense. Its destination by the complex interaction of multiple genetic factors. The Republic of Benin. Beyond just OCA2 had for centuries been one of the scientists have identified other genes that influence eye color and potentially when the Clotilda arrived, Foster negotiated with local traders and secured 110 men, transmembrane children who had been involved in melanin biosynthesis. From the kingdom of Dahomey. The TYRG produces tyrosinase, an important enzyme in the initiation of melanin. They were people with families, languages. The IRF4 gene is a transcription factor violently from regulate pigmentation genes. Among them was the TYRP1 gene is responsible for the stabilization story would later become one of the most important. All of these genes and many others contribute to the final eye color phenotype, and whose descendants still live in Alabama today. The Africans were forced below deck into a cramped, hairless hole. To truly understand where hazel eyes come from, and the Clotilda turned back much further than modern Atlantic, back toward we need to look at human evolution. The journey lasted weeks. Conditions on the ship and ancestors you would expect from a vessel designed to smuggle had dark brown or nearly black eyes. Brutal, these eyes made perfect sense in the environments where humans first evolved. Every day at sea was a day near the equator where the sun is intense year-round. By 1860, American and British naval patrols were actively hunting slave protected against the damaging effects of ultraviolet radiation. Suspicious vessels. The melanin absorbed light before it could damage the sensitive structures of the eye. Clotilda slipped through. It also reduced glare and improved vision. In July of 1860, it reached the Alabama coast. Millions of years, this was the only eye color that existed. Foster and Meeher knew they were not safe. Then something word of the voyage had begun to leak. Humans began to migrate. Officials in Mobile moved out of Africa, already asking questions about a ship that had left the harbor months earlier and returned with an unusual cargo. As they moved into higher latitudes, the Clotilda were found intact, the sun loaded with the physical proof of an illegal slave voyage. Both men would face evolutionary pressure to maintain the extremely high levels of melanin. Meeher made a decision that would shape the next century and a half. Northern latitudes with less sunlight ordered the ship destroyed. Having very light eyes transferred the captain to a smaller vessel under cover of night, let more light into the eye, up the twisting channels of the moving vision in low light conditions, and hid them in the swamps. So, for the first time in human evolution, genetic variants that reduced melanin production began to persist, scuttled in these populations, sinking the burning hull instead of the muddy, tannin-stained waters. Scientific evidence suggests, in hopes that the mutation responsible for the entire spectrum of light eye colors emerged between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. No shipment, no proof. This wasn't a single mutation either. Different mutations occurred in different populations. Without the physical, the most significant one, the one that spread the furthest and had the most responsible for one of the last originated in a single voyages to America, walked away, resuming their lives, Black Sea, and what is now Southeastern Europe society. This mutation affected the HERC2 gene. You cannot burn away memory, creating a variation that could reduce OCA2 expression, and therefore lives on in the melanin survived. After the Civil War ended in 1865, it spread rapidly through early European aboard the Clotilda were freed, what's called a founder. Millions of other enslaved people across the South became common. Very freedom came with a population was small and isolated. These were people who had been kidnapped and offered some selective advantage. Now, thousands of miles from Africa, there were essentially only two eye colors, nowhere to go. Brown and blue. Remarkably, refused to help them get home, carried primarily the ancestral alleles. The original genetic survivors did what so many resilient communities carried the new mutations that had spread through European populations. They built something of their own. But 32 of the Clotilda's survivors pooled together European populations came into contact with land near Mobile Africa, the very man who had trafficked them. These groups had different frequencies that they governed by their own customs. Some of these people had language and their own laws. Others carried the brown eye genes. As close as they could manage to a piece of West Africa, mixed their children inherited combinations of both types. They called it African. This is where hazel eyes truly originate. It is known as African. Hazel eyes are the product of genetic admixture. Just a few miles north. They emerge when you inherit genes for generations. One ancestral the descendants of African genes carry the story of another. Clotilda, when you have these specific tradition survive. You end up with moderate melanin telling grandchildren high or low gatherings. You end up stubborn insistence that this history melanin in your iris. Even when the wider world you end up with that distinctive hazel appearance. Historians outside the community were on colors depending on lighting. There were no photographs of the ship. Looking at global data, this theory is strongly supported. Just stories passed down are most common faded memories where there's name written in a handful of old mixing between population records with different eye color genes. The Clotilda story was likely true and outlined, but exaggerated in detail. Others assumed the ship had simply rotted away significantly higher than the global whatever remained had been destroyed by decades of storms. The United States is one of the most genetically diverse populations in the world, with ancestors from Africa, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and every other continent. This diversity creates exactly the conditions for hazel eyes to be common. Specific populations show particularly high frequencies of hazel eyes. People of Irish ancestry commonly have hazel eyes. So do people of German ancestry, particularly from southwestern Germany and France. Spanish populations show high frequencies of hazel eyes. Middle Eastern populations frequently have hazel eyes. North African populations have substantial numbers of hazel-eyed individuals. Brazilian populations, which represent some of the most genetically mixed populations in the world, have very high frequencies of hazel eyes. In all of these cases, you're looking at populations with recent genetic admixture, populations that have been shaped by migration and intermixing. Ancient DNA studies support this narrative. By analyzing genetic material from ancient human remains, archaeologists and geneticists have been able to trace the movement of populations and the mixing of different genetic lineages. They found that populations in Europe 5,000 or 10,000 years ago looked genetically different from populations today. Migration, sometimes peaceful, sometimes driven by conquest or environmental pressure, constantly brought new genetic combinations into existing populations. Each wave of migration brought genes from different populations, and over generations, these genes mixed and recombined in new ways. The Hazel eye phenotype that we see today is a relatively recent product of this mixing. While the genetic variants responsible for hazel eyes existed for thousands of years, they only came together in the specific combinations necessary to produce hazel eyes when populations with different genetic backgrounds began to mix. This probably didn't happen significantly until within the last few thousand years, during periods of increased human migration and contact between distant populations. Which means, in a very real sense, hazel eyes are the eyes of the modern world. They're the eyes of population mixing and human movement. They carry within them the genetic legacy of human migration. This brings us back to modern genetic science and what we've learned from DNA testing. When commercial DNA testing companies offer to predict your eye color based on your genetics, they're working with the SNP data. They look at your RS913832 genotype. They check for RS18407. They might look at a few other markers depending on how advanced their testing is. And they make a prediction about what your eyes should look like. But as we've discussed, this prediction is often wrong. For blue eyes and brown eyes, modern prediction models have accuracy rates around 90%. But for hazel eyes, accuracy drops to somewhere between 70 and 80%. Hazel eyes are just harder to predict because they require such a specific combination of genetic factors. This is where the 5 newly discovered variants become so important. The variants are RS74-36, RS78544415, RS727-916, RS19-09490, and RS5512-17952 at a new layer of predictive power. Scientists can now look at your genotype, these markers, and get a better picture of what your eye color is likely to be. But even with these new markers, perfect prediction isn't possible. Eye color, scientists now understand, is not purely genetic. Environmental factors play a role. The way light interacts with your specific iris structure affects how your eye color appears. Epigenetic factors, changes in gene expression that don't involve changes to the DNA sequence itself, can influence melanin production. Age-related changes can affect eye color as people get older. Some people's eyes darken with age, others lighten. All of these factors mean that even with perfect genetic knowledge, you still can't perfectly predict eye color. Epigenetics deserves special mention because it's only recently becoming understood in the context of eye color genetics. Epigenetic modifications are alterations to your DNA that don't change the underlying genetic code, but instead affect how genes are expressed. They're like adjusting the volume knob on a radio. The station is still the same, but the sound level is different. In the case of eye color, epigenetic modifications can alter the level of expression of OCA2, HERC2, and other pigmentation genes. They can be influenced by environmental factors. They can be inherited from your parents. And they can vary throughout your lifetime. This means that 2 people with identical genotypes at all the relevant SNPs might still have slightly different eye colors due to epigenetic differences. The polygenic nature of eye color, the fact that up to 16 different genes are involved, means that there are an enormous number of possible genetic combinations. Mathematically, it's possible to have many different genotypes that all produce hazel eyes. Just like there are many different shades of brown eyes or blue eyes, there are many different shades of hazel eyes. Some hazel eyes are more golden. Others are more greenish. Some look almost brown with just a hint of green. Others are predominantly green with brown flecks. All of these variations result from subtle differences in which genetic variants you carry and how they interact with each other. Looking at specific populations gives us insight into how hazel eye genetics work. In Iraqi populations, researchers have studied the frequency of specific SNPs in people with different eye colors. They found that while our RS1293832 of the HERC2 gene and RS18407 of the OCA2 gene showed significant differences between blue-eyed and brown-eyed individuals, they showed much less difference between brown-eyed and hazel-eyed individuals. This suggests that hazel eyes occupy a middle ground genetically, with genetic markers that are partly similar to brown eyes and partly similar to other colors. The haplotype analysis, which looks at how genetic variants cluster together, showed strong linkage disequilibrium between these markers in all eye color groups, confirming that they're inherited together as a unit. In European populations, the geographic distribution of hazel eyes shows clear patterns. Hazel eyes are most common in regions with historical mixing between populations. Areas that were isolated for long periods show either very high frequencies of blue eyes or very high frequencies of brown eyes, depending on which original population settled there. But areas that saw repeated waves of migration or significant population mixing show high frequencies of hazel and other intermediate eye colors. This geographic pattern provides strong evidence for the admixture theory of hazel eye origins. The fact that we can now identify specific genetic variants that are associated with hazel eyes and that we're discovering new variants regularly suggests that our understanding of eye color genetics is still far from complete. The 5 variants discovered in 2026 are not the end of the story. As genetic research continues, more variants will likely be identified. Each one adds another piece to the puzzle. Each one helps explain why inherited traits are so much more complicated than we once believed.